We are live.
Great. So we'll do the intro piece just so people know who we are, what we're doing. This is the next piece of the section of the Wednesday, November 15th, 2023 meeting of the Renewable Energy Standard Working Group. We just went through a lot of data with TJ Poor. And as I was saying, thanks to TJ for bringing all that to us. I think along with co-chair Sheldon, we had a conversation leading into today's meeting about expressing the concern that we were going to have a lot of data and not that much time to dig into it as a group. That's just, it's part of the way we, part of life when you have a lot of data and an ambitious agenda. But I just want to reassure people that I think we will look for ways for us to come back to this as a group and have more time to dig in and ask questions. Like we had to defer a number of questions or limit it to a lightning round. And we all know there's a lot more we would like to understand and then share with each other. So I think I just wanted to flag that so the people know that Chair Sheldon and I and Jen had all talked about how do we make sure that people have a good experience with this data, not just sort of drink from the fire hose and feel awfully wet by the end of the meeting. Okay, that's it.
And there may not be any way around that, but here's the rationale. Another short presentation. There's going to be things you hear in this presentation that you have questions of. Please jot them down or put them in the chat. We'll pause periodically to take questions on air. And still there will be things you'd like to discuss further. The rationale for going through all the slides first, it's like a table of contents. So you can see what there is there first, and then come in to dial down on the details that that we can fit into the discussion at 10:30. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dean Murphy, the principal at the Brattle Group, and Wanjun Chang, the senior associate and economist at the Brattle Group. You have a presentation for us, and very similar to TJ's, there will be slides and some discussion and then some questions throughout. Dean,
Thank you very much, Jen. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to present the at least the draft results of our work here to this group. Wanjun is pulling up our slides. I'm going to give sort of a brief overview introduction, but I'm going to ask him to sort of walk through the slides and the results and describe it in detail. I'll chime in from time to time and happy to take clarifying questions as we go. So if we can just jump to the first real slide here, Wanjun. Whoops, back one to the overview slide. There we go. Okay, so our goal is to take the results of the PSD and SEA's study, their benefit cost analysis, and use that to drive an assessment of the macroeconomic impacts on Vermont under these 6 different scenarios that the Public Service Department had defined of this renewable or clean energy standard, this proposed standard going to 100%. And we're going to be focusing primarily on the impacts to GDP and employment. And we're going to do this by we're doing a macroeconomic impact analysis. This is sort of standard macroeconomic impact kinds of analyses for those 6 core scenarios regarding how Vermont might expand its RES. As I noted, the scenarios themselves and the data describing them were designed by the DPS and the Stakeholder Advisory Group. We are working to maintain consistency across our analysis and the benefit cost analysis. So we are using their outputs such as rate impacts, the incremental generating resource additions and where those occur, whether it's in Vermont or outside of Vermont, and the incremental cost of renewable energy. Those are all the inputs to our economic analysis. And before we dive in, I want to point out that we know the basic result before we start. And this comes directly out of the analysis that the DPS has done, that since the Vermont costs are greater than the net Vermont benefits, looking only at the impacts on Vermont ratepayers, so this is the ratepayer impact test, ratepayer impact measure, the RIM, we know that the GDP impact will be negative. That it will slightly, because it sort of costs more than the direct benefits to Vermont, it'll have a negative impact on GDP. What we don't yet know, and the reason we do this analysis, is to understand how big that impact will be and how it may differ across those 6 scenarios. And this is just a natural result of the economic context that we're working with here. That we're talking about a public good, or on the other side of that, a tragedy of the commons situation, where the costs that Vermont may pay to address a public good problem, the benefits of the benefits of what Vermont does are going to be spread very broadly across society. Only a very small share of what Vermont does will result in direct benefits to Vermont. Of course, the same is true on the other side. What is happening in other New England states across the US and across the world benefits Vermont as well. So this is sort of the natural result that you see in a situation that involves a public good like this. So we shouldn't be terribly surprised to see this. But I'm going to turn it over now to Wonjun, who is going to walk us through the details of this analysis and give us some insights into sort of the magnitude of the effects and why they differ as they do from one scenario to the next. So I'll turn it over to you now, Wonjun.
Thanks, Dean. Hi, I'm Wonjun. I am an economist with the Brattle Group. So thank you, TJ and Dean, for that overview. It really significantly reduces the amount of talking I need to do and bog you down with the details that you guys have already covered. Just to give you a high-level overview of what we're doing is, hope you can still see my cursor, but in this diagram, we're showing that the scenarios determined by the PSD and the stakeholder advisory group, that goes into the benefit cost analysis conducted by SEA. Now, where SEA leaves off is it provides the costs, of course, benefits also, but we take the costs that represent the renewable energy investment, and that part over here goes into plugs into the economic activity portion of the macroeconomic analysis, meaning as we procure renewable energy, we're going to generate labor employment, we'll be using physical capital like equipment and real estate, we'll be using goods produced by other sectors, calling them intermediate goods. So overall, by procuring more renewable energy resources, building more stuff, we'll see overall in New England, more economic activity being generated, contributing to growth. Now, on the other side of that, SEA also provides bill impacts for ratepayers. So given the bill impact price changes in one of the necessary consumption goods that the ratepayers in Vermont, the consumers in Vermont, producers in Vermont consume, we'll see a change in economy-wide consumption patterns driven by higher bill impacts. Now, coupling those two together, we'll see in our analysis how coupling those two together will result in some net GDP impact. We'll look at a number of measures, GDP, real GDP growth. We'll look at employment, consumer price index, tax revenue. So we're hoping to see the distributional impacts of consumption across 5 different income levels of households also. Although that specific feature won't be, that's something we're working out right now, will be included in the final presentation, not today. All right. Before I go on, any clarifying questions that we can make, just so that, I think Dean and I have provided just now a lot of information. So any questions?
Representative Sibilia, go ahead. You're muted now, or maybe your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can't ask my question right now, so.
Okay. Jen, then I'll move on.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. All right. So this is, I do not need to cover this. We just, TJ wonderfully covered and summarized the scenario definitions. So I'll be skipping this. This is the exact same image I took from SEA's slides. So we have the 6 core scenarios that we'll be dealing with in our analysis. And these are as follows. You guys are familiar with this. So we'll first be dealing with the investment costs of renewable energy and how that links to economic growth. So if you recall, in this chart, I mentioned 2 channels of economic growth. One was the increased economic activity driven by investment costs, and another was bill impact. So we'll first focus on the former. So from the BCA, from the benefit cost analysis provided by SEA, we have these incremental system costs by scenario. What you're looking at right now is the net present value, just so that you can see it in one chart, but we have it in terms of a schedule going from the year 2023 to 2035. The model, our analysis is terminal time year. So our job here, without going into too many details, is to take the incremental, the costs, the incremental costs incremental to 2022. We're going to break that down into, we're first interested in how much investment exists in Vermont versus the rest of the pool. So this is what we're showing right now. We're showing the breakdown by region. The shaded area is the rest of pool, and the solid area is Vermont. And we do this again, just to reiterate, we do this because investment generates economic activity. And we want to know if there are projects that are specifically taking place in Vermont versus the rest of the pool. We would like to track that so that we can estimate the economic activity, economic impacts at the region or the state level. On top of that, we also want to know, we want to know how building a different resource, a different type of generating technology contributes to the macroeconomy. And by that, I mean, It could be the case that building a megawatt of solar versus a megawatt of a wind versus hydro is going to be different in terms of the industrial inputs used in producing that technology. So again, the top chart here is the net present value of each of the scenario-specific incremental costs. Below are the corresponding resource mix in terms of capacity, megawatts. We see a lot of solar. And so far, I mean, although in the previous slide we've differentiated by region, this is not differentiated by region. This is just by technology type. Now, this is just a reminder that the generation charts that we saw in SEA slides or TJ slides, I just wanted to make sure that that was generation, and here on the bottom chart here is capacity. So although it looks like we have a ton of solar in terms of generation, well, we still have a significant amount of solar, but you'll see that the portions are quite different. And carrying on with the story here, now we have the resource mix for each scenario. On the right here, I'm showing the portion of labor versus capital versus materials here. Materials represents intermediate goods again, goods and services produced by other sectors, like the construction sector or the manufacturing sector or the services sector, all provide goods to the economy that you can purchase. So on this chart here, our analysis takes into account by technology how much of materials, labor, and capital. It's normally fuels too, but in this case, we're discussing renewable energy standards, so fuel is not right now an option. But we'll see how much of each of these, we call them production factor inputs, production factors, we end up consuming. Given all this information, we have the regional investment, so the investment distributed by region. We have how that investment translates into materials, labor, and capital in the market. We can translate SEA's incremental costs by region and ultimately by region and the various elements, the production factors that go into the producing sectors of the economy. So in the shaded area, I apologize, this isn't the most, the easiest chart to interpret, but the shaded area is the rest of the pool. The solid areas are Vermont. And yellow is materials, the intermediate goods. Labor is the lighter blue, and capital is the navy. So given this breakdown of system costs, we expect to see, even if two scenarios were to have the same total incremental costs, if they differ in the resource mix or if they differ in how that investment is distributed regionally, you will see different economic impacts, different GDP impacts. So that's the expectation here. Again, I'll pause quickly here because this is one segment ended.
There's a couple specific questions. Ken, it looks like you put your question into the comment, but if you'd prefer to say it online, you can do so.
Sure. I'm just trying to reconcile in TJ's presentation, he talks about the hydro being legacy, which I'm assuming is buying RECs from like main hydro plants that already exist. but in the Brattle slides, they have a portion that seems to reflect new hydro. So I'm just trying to reconcile those two positions.
I believe, and TJ and Dean, please jump in if needed. Maybe the slide that TJ was showing was total resource mix as opposed to incremental. I do not recall the specific slide.
Yeah, I believe there is a quite a bit of legacy hydro, but going forward in the scenarios that SEA has characterized, there are very small amounts of hydro additions that I understand that is sort of upgrades to existing hydro facilities.
And does that clarify the ambiguity?
Well, sort of, but I mean, on this slide up now, I look at scenario 1. It seems to be solar and then a large chunk of hydro, if I'm reading the colors correctly. It seems like a very big investment for a little bit of hydro development.
That is hydro that is in there. It's in the business as usual case. And so it's not incremental hydro by and large.
That's a very good point, Dean, right? So on this chart here, this is this is not incremental to BAU.
If you were to subtract the BAU out of this, you'd find the incremental amounts for each of the scenarios.
All right, thanks. Leave it there for now.
Mm-hmm.
Comment, and then you can move on to the next slide. It looks like, do you take into account the Vermont impact on the capital side? For many in-state Vermont projects, the capital and return is from and to outside of the state. Is that taken into account?
So I do want to make a clarifying statement on terminology. Capital here is economic capital that represents equipment, real estate, like computers. This is different from very related to, but different from the capital in the financial sense. So to answer your question, money is not specifically modeled, explicitly modeled in our model. We do not simulate the dynamics of borrowing, lending, and the impacts of the interest rate, the varying interest rates. It's just too many potential instances that we just can't keep track of. There's a dimensionality problem to it.
And I think it's fair to say that yes, the model implicitly tracks those capital flows from out of state. In the same way, when you build a megawatt of solar, some of the materials to build that solar, probably the solar panels, are actually imported. Some of the capital is also imported in the sense that construction in Vermont is financed partly by Vermont capital, and here I mean monetary capital, but also from capital outside the state, so that people in Vermont have investments all over the place, so these flows are going both ways. People outside Vermont have some of their investments are based in Vermont, so the model implicitly accounts for that, even though it doesn't explicitly model the money itself.
Thank you. Wondering, it's so helpful to have these pauses, and I suspect that questions will continue to gather. So my encouragement to folks is to either jot them down on paper so you can raise them on air or put them into the chat. And at each pause, we'll try to catch some of those ambiguities before the cloud of confusion gets too large. Go ahead.
Okay, so we're done with the densest part of the presentation. So rate impacts. This is the second economic impact modeling that I referred to. bill impacts, increase in the electricity rates will influence how we consume, right? Electricity being a necessary good in many different ways, especially for consumers and the producers also in the state of Vermont. So this is just showing over time and by scenario how the rates determined in SEA's benefit cost analysis, how the rates develop over time, how they grow over time. So just pointing out scenario 6, it's in the green on the very top with this little blip. This is the rate impact relative to BAU, both in dollar terms and percentage terms. But you'll see that generally the rate impact increases as the res target increases. In scenario 6, it goes as high up as up to around just below 8.5% at 2035. Just generally speaking, all else equal, if we have increased electricity prices that consumers face, consumers will have less income for non-electricity goods, and that can lead to, so less disposable income leads to maybe less consumption of non-electricity goods. For producers, they have less of a budget now because of increased electricity prices. You have less budget for other production inputs that they need to purchase to produce. So overall, not always again, but all else equal, increased prices will lead to slower growth. Just to make it clear, SEA had two types of perspectives, I think they called. They had the societal cost test, where they were able to include and quantify the benefits, the benefits that relate to reduction in pollution. In our case, our model is really, this is one of the things I'm most proud of in our model. It's just based on open source government data. So the macroeconomic model considers a circular flow of income going from producers to consumers to government agencies and so on for 50 states and across many, many sectors. We get that data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA. They have the input-output tables there. Because they don't quantify explicitly the benefits of reducing pollution, we are sticking with the RIM measure, the ratepayer impact measure, that only quantifies the more conventional market impacts. Okay, so again, just very quickly, this is before we jump into the macroeconomic impacts. Are there any questions? All right. So as Dean mentioned in his intro, GDP growth is virtually the same. And we've tried to communicate this with the chart, the very first chart on the left top. We are actually modeling, or we're actually displaying the real GDP growth for all 7 scenarios, including BAU plus the 6 core scenarios. And it's very, very difficult to tell them apart because they're overlaying on each other. Now, if you look at the rate impact relative to BAU in percentage terms to really magnify the impact, you do see differences. And you do see differences, meaningful differences, which we can explain and get into across the scenarios. Sorry, I was pointing to the rate impact. This is just again referring to SEA's analysis. The GDP impacts are on this lower chart. Now, GDP grows almost at the same rate, but slightly, very slightly slower relative to the BAU. And that's expected, right? Because there are costs. What drives this is the increased costs that Vermont's consumers pay for, that trickle down into their rates. So rates, again, results in less disposable income for consumers and a smaller budget for non-electricity inputs for producers. So I do want to emphasize that this GDP impact that you're seeing, which is shown as a negative percentage, is a net outcome. It does take into account the added economic activity, created from the renewable energy investment that happens in New England. But the dominant effect, at least in Vermont, is the increased rates that the ratepayers face. But again, I would like to emphasize the axis here. We're talking about at maximum 0.17% of GDP, real GDP.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Wongjun, if you don't mind, to sort of add a little bit of perspective on that. That is a very small impact on GDP, and that's the cumulative impact over the 10 or 12-year period here. You'll notice that the bottom graph, which is the GDP impacts, is almost a symmetric reflection of the top graph, which is the rate impacts. As Wongjun said, the rate impacts are the primary driver of the GDP impacts. So the scenarios that have the smallest rate increase have caused the smallest decrease in GDP. To the extent that the lower graphic is not a perfect reflection of the upper graphic, it's because of the other effects. In addition to the rate impact, there are the investments that occur within Vermont. And so you'll see the scenarios that have that bend back up, that have a smaller negative GDP impact. Those are the ones where there's relatively more investment within Vermont. And so you're getting that positive impact that partially offsets the negative impact of the rates. But again, I think really important to recognize the difference in the GDP growth is really indistinguishable on the left graph over time. That those lines really lie on top of one another almost exactly, not quite, but almost. I'll turn it back to you, Wongjun.
Thanks, Dean. Yep. So again, the one element that we haven't discussed is, and I just mentioned the net impacts. We have the downward pressure on growth from increased electricity prices. We also have the upward movement in economic growth that comes from increased economic activity from building stuff, building resources, investing in projects in Vermont specifically. But there's also many of these scenarios have parts of the project in the rest of the pool outside of Vermont. Now, outside of Vermont, the projects there are being paid for by Vermont, right, through the ratepayers. they have they can benefit. These rest of the pool, the neighboring states, grow in terms of, they experience economic growth because they have projects being built and paid for by Vermont, but in their states locally. So the small growth that we see in the neighboring states, that also influences economic growth in Vermont through trade, right? If one neighboring state does well and a business is increasing economic output and it uses goods produced in Vermont, then that spurs more demand for Vermont goods, and again, contributing to maybe more employment, upward movement in economic growth. So all three are taken into account in our GDP analysis, being rates, renewable energy investments, and also the growth in neighboring states. Okay, so we have GDP. Next is tax revenue, and it's really great that Dean just. Yes.
Sorry, I do have a question, and I don't know if it should land here or not. That was submitted in the chat, and I'm bringing it here because my untrained eye just hears GDP. So, or year. This is from Senator Watson, who's not on the call now. But if you're able to answer to it, then she'll be able to see the recording. She writes, I have a concern about Brattle Group's analysis connected to the cost for solar that TJ talked about. Since they didn't use Vermont data, particularly from standard offer data about solar, and instead used much more expensive values, I'm afraid that the Brattle's indicators are skewed to have a more negative effect on the GDP than would be realistic for Vermont. Is now a good time to speak to that?
Sure. I think that definitely has an impact.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Yeah, I think this statement is absolutely true, to the extent that the costs of solar are overstated. It will overstate the rate impact of that, and it will overstate the negative GDP impact. It's important to keep in mind the uncertainties in this. Anytime you estimate something like the cost of solar, it's important to be as accurate as you can, but it's not possible to know with certainty what the future cost of solar will be in Vermont versus outside. I'm not suggesting that, and I don't know because we didn't do this analysis, whether a sort of a deeper analysis might give you a different price for solar in Vermont. The senator's observation is absolutely correct that if you did have a lower cost for solar, there would be a smaller impact on GDP. There are lots of other uncertainties in here too. One that's very important to keep in mind is the cost of the business as usual scenario. In order to, and I don't want to speak too much to SEA's analysis, but we do analyses like this as well. And so I have some sense of what's going on. They were forced to make some projection of what power costs, of non-renewable power costs would be. And they found that renewable power would cost a modest amount more than their non-renewable power projection. However, the cost of non-renewable power is highly uncertain. It's driven very much by fossil costs. And so to the extent that, particularly in New England, natural gas prices were to go up, the cost of the business as usual could go up, but the cost of the renewables would stay pretty much where they are. And so that, and vice versa, if the cost of gas goes down, that'll magnify the relative difference between these renewable costs and the business as usual costs. So any analysis like this contains a number of uncertainties, and it's important to keep in mind the relative magnitudes of these various uncertainties. We've certainly seen in New England over the last few years, as fossil prices have gone dramatically up and then dropped back, that the price of fossil electricity does change quite a bit. And so any analysis like this is necessarily based on some, reasonable projection of what prices will be, but there's still quite a bit of uncertainty around how it will actually turn out. One of the advantages of renewable energy is that it reduces the dependence on imported fossil fuels that have volatile prices. So even if in expected value, the cost may be somewhat higher, the volatility of rates can be considerably lower. So I'll pause now.
Yeah, so at the risk of, I know there's going to be some discussion around this probably at 10:30 as well, but there are a couple hands raised from the legislation team and also a comment. So Representative Sibilia, do you have a question? Reaction?
It is on this point. I can wait until 10:30, but
No,
I guess
go ahead.
Yep, my question, I guess, to Dean would be, why wouldn't we use the Vermont standard offer numbers in the calculation? So what is the argument against that? I don't know if that's the question for Dean or if that's the question for TJ. So again, it could be a 10:30 question.
Yeah, I think it is primarily a question for TJ, and
okay.
I don't want to try to answer for him. We have taken the results of the SEA analysis, and in order to be consistent with that, we have used their values.
Okay. I do want to bookmark that, and I'm hoping that TJ will be with us at 10:30. Thank you.
He will be here, and I think there's also a comment in the chat that's related to that too. So I do think it's a fuller discussion. Senator Bray?
Yeah, thanks. I just want, I don't know if it's coming in your analysis, but I just wanted to ask a sort of a bigger picture context question. So there are lots of unavoidable costs associated with climate change. And, like health impacts, recovery costs for utilities, recovery costs when you're flooding in downtown Montpelier, et cetera. And I don't know the scale of those costs compared to the scale of the costs we're talking about associated with rate increases. And I'm just feeling like it might be helpful to have a sense of, magnitude of one versus the other. And I don't know if you were asked to, speak to that point, but I'm thinking about it because it's one of those balancing questions. Like, how do we frame this up, and how do we balance a rate increase compared to other things that are going on in society more broadly?
And that is an excellent question and point. That is beyond the scope of our analysis here, and I can't speak to the relative magnitudes of those costs because I haven't studied them. But it is important to recognize that this analysis doesn't account for those. We're not attempting to account for those. So in particular, we're not accounting for the impact of the social cost of carbon, which at a very broad level does incorporate some of those costs. And there's plenty of discussion about how well any particular estimate of the social cost of carbon may incorporate those costs. This goes back to the issue I raised right at the very front, which is this is a public good problem. The increment of Vermont's renewable electricity, the increment to global carbon emissions that might be, or the decrement to global carbon emissions from Vermont going from its current RES to 100% will be very, very small, and the impacts that are felt globally will be very, very small because Vermont is a very small part of the world. And the increments to those costs in Vermont of flooding, climate change, changes in temperatures, et cetera, because Vermont's own contribution to the global climate is very small, the effects that you feel in Vermont are going to be very small from the activities that you've undertaken. you'll feel much more impact from what happens in China and India than you will from what you did in Vermont. And yet, this is the nature of a public good problem or a tragedy of the commons, viewed from the other side, that each player if they look at their own narrow self-interest, would say, well, I'd rather not contribute to solving this problem. Let everybody else solve the problem, and my failure to contribute will make almost no difference. And yet, if everyone takes that same approach, you end up with exactly that tragedy of the commons. So it's difficult to say that Vermont's actions in reducing its emissions will have direct impacts in Vermont. And yet, it is important for Vermont, every state, and every country to participate in reducing emissions in order to abate the global impacts of this. So it's the structure of it's the economic structure of a public good or of a tragedy of the commons, that the individual making a decision based on the direct impacts of their actions on their outcomes will lead you to the wrong solution.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks. And I'm just hoping at some point, not right now, that we'll be able to put those two things in the scale a little bit and see the relative costs and impacts. Thanks.
That would be a valuable thing, I believe.
So quick time check as you go back into the slides. There are 7 minutes or so left of this presentation and clarifying Q&A before a quick break.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll move on to the next metric, tax revenues in Vermont. So in general, tax revenue grows at a similar rate to GDP. Now, I think, about to say, Dean had pointed out this upward curving dynamic that we saw in the GDP chart. So we saw this here too. We'll talk more about that in 10 seconds. Just to go over the basic points, tax revenue increases from output, so economic output, but businesses producing more. But there's also the consumption element, right? So there's consumption taxes. So tax revenue is one of those things that, again, it's no surprise that it's growing at a similar rate to GDP because it is part of GDP. It's influenced by both economic activity, a very important driver in our GDP impact analysis, but also impacted by ratepayer impacts, right? So rate increases, because there's the consumption element, the consumption aspects of tax revenue. So again, the basic dynamics here are tax revenue increases in renewable energy investments that take place in Vermont, and revenue decreases with electricity rates as higher rates result in reduced economic activity for ratepayers. Now, going back to, well, first of all, scenario 6. I think in scenario 6, in GDP also, you saw scenario 6, the green line stick out. And that's because scenario 6 is a scenario in which we assume that there's significant portion of the resource mix lies outside of Vermont. So if you see the incremental investment over time on the left chart, scenario 6 is up there. It's slightly lower than scenarios 2 and 4. But how it really differs from those two higher cost scenarios is that its percentage of investment that lies in Vermont is significantly lower. Now, that translates into less economic activity. So just to recap, what you're doing is Vermont is still paying a very, they're paying for the cost at the higher level, but the economic activity that's experienced within Vermont, so the economic growth that is induced by investing in local Vermont projects, is lower in this scenario. So higher rates, lower economic activity. And that translates into slower economic growth. That's what we're seeing. Tax revenue, same story. We have scenario 6 stick out because we have the consumption tax revenue decreases because we have increased rates. But then output tax revenue is also lower because there just isn't much production going on in Vermont. Now, quickly to touch on this curvature here, what we're seeing is the very slight negative impact that we see in scenarios 2 and 4 are the magnitude of it is decreasing, so it's becoming less negative. One of the things we can see, how we can explain that is for those years, for these latter years, we still see for scenarios 2 and 4, the yellow and orange, the investment, the cost associated with the investment increase at a pretty linear pace, still pretty aggressive. But what slows down is the increase in rate impacts, the increase in rates. So you'll see that there's a pretty noticeable slope change going from the year 2030 to 2032. So going from here to post 2032, this segment, it becomes flatter. Now, what that translates into is there is now economic activity from increased renewable energy investment, and the economic growth from that is offsetting more of the slower growth that comes from increased rates. So that's why we're seeing a little bit of a turnaround starting 2031. And the same here, starting 2031, the negative impact decreases in magnitude. Then is this, I know we're up against time. Would you like me to just go through the next 2-3 slides quickly and then maybe take questions after?
Is anyone sitting on an urgent question? And Wanjun, do you know about how long it will take to cover those slides? Just presentation-wise, no questions?
Yep, I think 3 minutes, 4 minutes.
Great. There is a question that's popping up. Are these GDP numbers including the incentive dollars from the federal government?
Incentive.
I think in order to answer that best, I think we would need to turn to TJ and SEA, because we're taking the results of their analysis, and I believe they do, but I'm going to let them answer that question.
Yeah, let's hold that then for after the break.
Yes, my understanding is that they do. Sorry to jump in.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
Thank you, TJ.
All right. Wanjun, the floor is yours.
Yes. We see employment also has a very similar story. All the metrics in general follow the GDP growth trajectory. Again, net employment grows at a slightly slower rate compared to the business as usual scenario. Employment is again directly impacted by economic activity, but unlike tax revenue, it's impacted more on the production side. Yes, everything is connected. So the employment will be impacted by increased rates, but not as much as tax revenue, which is again, that shows up in the curvature we were seeing in the tax revenue, the curving up, we no longer see in the employment aspect of Vermont. And that's because of the first order impacts that are not associated with consumption. One of the things I expressed net employment. In this scenario, I'm not presenting sector-specific results because we still have a little bit of refining to do on our analysis, but we are seeing increased employment in the electricity sector and the sectors that contribute to carrying out a project, building stuff. So the construction sector, services sector, manufacturing sector are the sectors that experience higher employment. And the energy intensive manufacturing sectors and the transportation sectors, trucking, for instance, are seeing marginally less employment in these sectors.
Can I just jump in? Again, I really want to emphasize, we're not talking about employment going down. We're not talking about GDP going down. We're talking about both of those will rise over this period, and they will rise slightly less quickly in these scenarios than they would in the business as usual case. So it's not the economy is shrinking by any means. It's not that employment is shrinking. It is increasing at an ever so slightly lower rate than it is in the business as usual.
Thank you, Dean. Yep, that's something to keep on reminding us.
These graphics make it look like, oh my gosh, things are going down, GDP is going down, employment is going down, tax revenues are going down. They're not going down. They're just going up slightly less quickly than in the business as usual.
In the final presentation, we'll be sure to include aggregate results to communicate otherwise. Okay, this is the last slide, Jen. This is the Consumer Price Index in Vermont, and this is just to explain what this is. This is the average price of the goods that's consumed by consumers in Vermont. So the CPI, again, very similar growth trajectory with compared to GDP. The CPI increases in economic activity through renewable energy investments and decreases in electricity rates. So nothing more to say here. As mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we do have a slide dedicated to the distributional impacts of consumptions across households by income levels. That's something we will be looking more into and presenting in our final set of slides. But I'll end it here.
Any clarifying questions from the past couple of slides? You can raise your hand, or if so, and we'll take it on air, or you can put it into the chat. William, looks like you've got a question.
I've got a question, but it might be, I don't know if it's going to be a long answer. So I don't know if, I mean, these folks are going to be in the next broader segment, right? So I don't know how pressed for time folks are.
Well, I think the distinction here is if it's a clarifying question or if it's going to be more of a discussion question. Discussions we're going to hold for after the break.
So it is a clarifying question. And, I'll put my apologies out front because I don't do what you folks do. So this might either A, be a dumb question, or it may be poorly asked. But what I'm wondering about, and particularly from the perspective or the context of Vermont being a very small state, I'm wondering whether you're modeling, when you're looking at, let's take employment, the impact of rate changes on employment, is it to oversimplify it, does your modeling basically look at establishes a basic relationship, and then as rates change, there's a proportionate change in employment? The question that I have is, I think for the most part, that's a very realistic analysis for most companies. But obviously, there are going to be companies where rate changes contribute to a tipping point where where otherwise you might expect a rate change to lead to, say, a 20% reduction in employment. But because those companies are reaching a tipping point, they just shut down entirely. So you get a 100% reduction for that company as opposed to a 20%. Now, I would think if you're looking nationally or a really big economy, maybe that's a distinction without much of a difference. But given how small Vermont is, does your modeling sort of capture those jumps or those disproportionately negative employment impacts or other impacts that would result from some companies actually just shutting down entirely? Does that make sense?
It does. The short answer is no, we do not model discrete jumps in. So we're not simulating very large, relatively large firms within Vermont completely shutting down, thus simulating this very discrete jump. Everything is on a sector level, right? Not at a firm level. So the production functions are more smooth. I won't go into the details there, but that's I think that's the gist of my answer.
And it's worth noting that the government data this is based on, the relationships between sector, how activity in one sector affects activity in another, those are based on a history that includes things like every now and then a firm shuts down. Sometimes it's a big firm, or maybe it'll relocate out of state. So in aggregate, those things are captured in those relationships in the data that our model depends on. Here, we are looking at really quite small effects. And so I think it'd be quite difficult to attribute the shutdown of a particular company to the electric rate increases. A number of companies will shut down in Vermont over the next 10 years, with or without this RES. And it'd be difficult to point to any one after the fact and say, oh, that was actually triggered by the higher rates that were prompted by the RES, just because these effects are quite small. And typically a company shutting down, it doesn't shut down because of one small effect in one factor. It's because the economy shifted or something happened at that particular company. But the aggregate effect of those is already captured in the data that we're using.
Sure, and I appreciate those last couple of points you made. I guess,
William, I'm going to actually pause. William, I'm going to pause the discussion for now, unless it's a very quick clarifying comment.
Very quick, but would it be fair to say that the smaller the state or the smaller the economy, the more uncertainty or downside risk there might be because of that distinction in terms of forecasts?
I think it might be safe to say that in a smaller economy, the uncertainty is a little bit greater, but I wouldn't say it's more downside risk because there's also more upside risk. There might just be more uncertainty. And the closer you focus the lens, the more sort of deviation from the average you might see.
Yeah, that's a longer discussion about the upside risk in Vermont, but I appreciate your answers. Thanks.
Senator Bray, and then we'll take a break.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to hold my question for after, but just put it on the table so that it's not a surprise to our presenters. So I don't know if we can at some point talk a little bit about when we look at models or predictions and stuff like that, we have margins of error, confidence intervals, all that kind of stuff. Some of these figures are so fine that I'm just wondering if they occur within a range of noise, not to deprecate the model in any way, but I'm just trying to understand
how tightly we should, read this data. So I'll park it there and look forward to wait suspensefully for the answer post break.
I will say now only that that is an excellent question, and we'll address it shortly.
So
Thank you.
let's do this. I think we're overdue for a little break, and I have 10 minutes budgeted. We'll come back at 10:45, so you have a little bit of a wider margin. At that point, your presenters will also be available as needed to answer questions and distinctions, but you can also open it up to discussion among group members. There will be a slight preference given to folks who haven't spoken yet, and also a slight preference given to clarifying the data, because this is your chance to really work with the folks who have been producing it and putting it together. So